In this session of Godonomics, we're going to talk about what would God say to John Keynes. You can't go to a Cub Scout, a tennis match, or a soccer game without people having an opinion about economics today, or at least questions about it. And as a pastor, I've gotten to see the real problems that occur when a family gets in massive debt. I've seen divorces, I've seen addictions, I've seen all kinds of real problems that occur when people don't play out God's wisdom in their personal, family, and certainly in a nation's finances. So today I want to talk about John Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. He was actually British, so it would be John Maynard Keynes from England. He was a brilliant economist who really changed everything. And even if you haven't heard about him, I promise you the influence of his thinking on both our nation and people's thinking about money is highly influential. Yet when you study what he taught, you find that both political sides in America follow his ideas. Herbert Hoover, FDR, George Bush, Clinton, Barack Obama, they all follow this way of thinking. And yet, his wisdom on the subject of money is almost the direct opposite of everything God taught on money. And that's a lot of the reason we're in such a problem as a nation today, is because we've gone with John Maynard Keynes over what Jesus and what God taught us. So let's talk about John Maynard Keynes. If you've got a newspaper recently, or a Newsweek or Time Magazine, you see he's been highlighted. John Maynard Keynes, Time Magazine. Also Newsweek, it said, we're all socialists now. Well, is that true, and what does it mean? Well, John Keynes ultimately moves you toward a socialistic type mindset. But what did he teach, and why is it important, and why should we look at it? Well, I think it's because it's highly influential. He taught that we should spend our way out of debt, that we should borrow more when we're in financial trouble, and that ultimately that would work out. It's a lot like a story I heard about an Englishman. There was an Englishman who found his way to Paris, and he decided to go to a very small hotel, and he got there and he pulled out a 100-pound note. He put it on the desk. He said, "I'd like a room for the evening," and he made his way up, shaken but not stirred. He went up to look at his room, and the hotel owner was so glad to have this 100-pound note because he was in incredible debt. He had borrowed money, 100 pounds, to pay the butcher. So he runs to the butcher and he says, "Here's the 100 pounds I owe you. Thanks for the food last week. Appreciate it." The butcher says, "Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks so much." The butcher then runs over to the baker and says, "Hey, I borrowed 100 pounds from you so I could get the food last week? Yeah, here's your money back." Whew, thank goodness. The baker then runs to his wife and says, "Honey, remember how we had that special night at the hotel to celebrate anniversary last week? Yeah. Can you run this 100 pounds back to the hotel clerk?" 100 pounds runs back to the hotel clerk. "Hey, thanks so much. Here's your 100 pounds back." Hotel clerk says, "I appreciate it. Thanks." Meanwhile, the Englishman doesn't really like the room. It's not up to his standards. He comes down the stairs. He goes, "Oh, the room is rubbish. Could I have my 100-pound note back?" The guy gives him his 100-pound note back, and he wanders off. Well, what just happened there? Suddenly, everybody's out of debt. There was an economic cycle that happened, but nobody produced anything. Nobody created anything, and yet everyone's better off? Something weird's going on here. And Keynesian economics does the same thing. There's this illusion of an economy, but underneath it's all built on borrowing and inflating and spending money you don't have. Let's review from last session. Godonomics is about producing. We produce a good or a service. We produce it in such a way to produce a profit. We think about other people's needs so that they will want to choose to buy our product. We profit from it. From our profits, we now have savings. Savings is having more money than it costs you to produce your widget or your gimmick or your service. From your savings, you can then make decisions about giving. You give to those who are poor and needy. You're able to invest in more jobs and more opportunities to provide more wealth and create more wealth. And you're able to spend on goods and services for yourself that other people have produced. It begins with producing, making something, profiting from it, savings, and then being able to do any of these three things. Now, Keynesian economics doesn't start with production. It starts with consuming. I want to consume. I want to buy. I want to get. Now, even if I don't have enough money saved to buy it, I need to consume to get it. Now notice, Godonomics is about focusing on others. It's always an outward focus, because if I don't put other people's needs ahead of my own, I go out of business. Savings, and I have savings, so what? I can invest in other people. It's a you-centered approach. Consumeronomics, or Keynesian economics, is a selfishly focused. It's all about me. I need to consume, but I have no money. I haven't produced anything. But I deserve it. I deserve more than I can afford. I deserve more because, I've worked hard my whole life. So I'm going to borrow. Where do I borrow from? Most families and marriages, I borrow from a credit card. The problem with a credit card is I enslave myself. What do you mean enslave yourself? It's just a credit card. Whenever you put your finances or your expenses on a credit card, you're enslaved because you have to pay back that principal plus interest. Albert Einstein said that compounded interest is the most powerful force in the universe because it builds and builds and builds and builds. Compounded interest in your savings works to your advantage. Your money builds and builds and builds and builds with compounded interest. But when you're borrowing, compounded interest works against you because your debt builds and builds into a snowball you can never catch up with. Why are we in the problems that we're in today as a country? If you go to U.S. debt clock, you can find out up to the moment how much money we have borrowed and consumed as a nation. As of this morning, we are $12 trillion in debt. If you don't know what $1 trillion is, don't worry, the government doesn't either. $12 trillion is a million. At this moment, that's how much we've borrowed. Now, how does a nation borrow? Like the U.S. government, we have a consumer-based economy. We're not producing nearly what we used to. We consume other people's production. So we borrow. A government has 3 ways it can borrow and get money. It can enslave itself by borrowing from other countries' savings, like we borrow from China and from Japan, but we have to pay them back, the principal plus interest over time. We inflate our currency, which we'll talk about in a later session, or we borrow the money from the producers, those people who are actually producing things, small business owners, large business owners. Those producers, we take from them through taxation so that we can keep our consuming services going on. So these are your choices: enslaving yourself, inflating, or taxes, all 3 of which ultimately hurt the poor, because if you tax the producers, they don't produce as many jobs. If you inflate the currency, the money the poor have isn't worth as much. And if you borrow and enslave yourself to the future, you're enslaving not only this generation, but future generations to those payments. So this is Godonomics, and this is consumeronomics, or Keynesian economics. Now you're going to hear somebody say, Chad doesn't know what he's talking about. The Chinese and the Japanese have to keep loaning us money because they need us to consume their products. We are intricate. We are a pivotal part of the economy. They couldn't live without us. Well, Peter Schiff, who is an Austrian economist, which is the opposite of Keynesian economics, he has a great illustration on this. And it's an illustration about 5 castaways on an island. It's not Gilligan's Island. And it's an American and 4 Asians. And we'll make them, for the sake of this illustration, 2 Japanese and 2 Chinese. They get to the deserted island and they divvy up the jobs. How are we going to survive? How are we going to take care of ourselves? So the American, being the swaggart that he is, turns and says, I got a plan. I want 2 Japanese guys. You're going to be fish. You're going to get fish, enough for yourself and for me. He turns to 2 Chinese guys, says, I want you to work all day to find fruit and coconuts and cut those coconuts open. It'll be hard work, but it'll be worth it. So all day long, the 2 Japanese guys, the 2 Chinese guys, they work to provide for themselves and for the fat American. Now he says, now here's what I'm going to do. The American says, I'm going to lay myself here on the beach all day long, and at the end of the day, I'm going to consume your products. All right. Well, at the end of the day, sure enough, they bring the fish and they bring the food and they bring the fruit, and the American consumes it. Well, he's a vital part of the economy, isn't he? I mean, what would they do if somebody wasn't there to consume their products? And this is what modern economists want you to believe, that the fat American who has a service sector job, he owns a tanning salon that he's the one client for, is pivotal to the Japanese and the Chinese. They have to keep loaning to us because we're eating their food. Well, at some point, if we have to borrow the money from the same people to buy the stuff they produce, they're going to get onto it and say, why don't we just not feed the fat American? Why don't we just make enough for ourselves and not work so hard? You see, it looks like an economy, but it's actually not, because it's built on the assumption that in American pride and arrogance, we are so important because we're going to eat your stuff while borrowing your money. It makes no sense at all. Well, why is John Keynes so popular then? Well, here's why. His real goal was not to build a sound economy. His real goal was to destroy capitalism. In fact, here's what he said. He said, capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. Now see, he's coming directly at Adam Smith here. He's saying people are wicked. How can you expect wicked people to give to other people? But he's going to promote socialism. But he's going to assume then, if you put me in charge, I'm the one person that wouldn't be wicked. I'm the one person who would not look out for my own self-interest. I'm the one person who would take from the producers and I would fairly distribute it. That never happens. It doesn't happen in Russia. It didn't happen in China. It doesn't happen anywhere in human history. Because whenever you put a wicked person in charge, they do wicked things. And like we talked about in the last section, capitalism does not eliminate greed. It neutralizes it in a free market system. So John Keynes says, I'm trying to destroy capitalism. How would I do it? He said, here's how. The best way to destroy capitalism is to debauch the currency. By a continued process of inflation, government can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, the important part of the wealth of their citizens. This is the opposite of what God said. God says he wants each one of us to experience personal liberty, prosperity, and generosity. And for this session, we're going to look at two slogans. Two slogans that contrast Godonomics from Keynesian economics. Number one, we spend our way to slavery, not prosperity. And number two, act your own wage. We'll look at the second one in a moment. We spend our way to slavery, not prosperity. See, John Keynes wants you to believe that if you're in debt and if you're in trouble, just borrow more. You can spend your way out of recession. You can spend your way out of the hole you're in. You don't spend your way to prosperity. You spend your way to slavery. Maybe you had a grandma or grandpa, or maybe you had a mom or dad who had some common sense, and they turned to you and said, you know what, thrift is important. If you're having your income go down, spend less. Find a cheaper way to do it. It was called common sense. It seems like anymore there's nothing common about common sense. John Keynes comes along and he says, no, there's a totally new enlightened way of looking at it. You need to understand, I'm coming from England and we're much smarter than you. We're the elites. Here's what you need to do. Don't spend less. Instead, if you owe your bank manager £1,000, you're at his mercy. But if you owe him £1,000,000, he's at your mercy. I actually had a conversation just last month over the dinner table with a relative who said, I heard this great quote and it makes so much sense. And he quoted that quote. I said, do you know who said that? He said, no. I said, John Keynes. He goes, so that guy was brilliant. Brilliant? Look what he's saying. Back to the board. If you have borrowed money from your lender and you owe them £1,000 or $1,000, they're going to have leverage over you. You got to pay that back, right? Because you don't own anything. John Keynes says, well, don't actually start producing anything. Don't spend less so you can profit and save. Instead, borrow more. So now you owe them $1,000,000, $1 trillion. It's the same thing we're doing with China and Japan. They need us to keep eating their food. Let's keep borrowing more. We're so important they couldn't stop lending to us. It's utter nonsense. Because what happens when you owe somebody £1,000,000? You still own nothing. You have no assets. You have no production. You have no savings. All you have is debt. We don't spend our way to prosperity. We spend our way to slavery. And this is the opposite of what God said. Here's some of God's wisdom. Romans chapter 13, verse 8. Owe no one anything except to love one another. For he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. The borrower is servant to the lender. The borrower, when you borrow money, you become the servant or enslaved to the lender. The lender can now have leverage over you. It can tell you what to do. It can enslave you. That's what happens. This isn't just personally. This isn't just in a family, but God gave the same wisdom to the nation of Israel. He said to the nation of Israel, I want you to go ahead and have savings so that you can lend in investing in other ventures, but don't borrow. Be somebody who blesses other people by using your savings to increase prosperity, but don't be a borrower or you'll be enslaved. And I got you out of Egypt. Let's not do that again. Let's stay free. Here's how he says it. Deuteronomy chapter 28. The Lord's going to open to you his good treasure. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. Why? Because if you do, the alien who is among you, the other nation that you borrow from, will get higher and higher and higher. and you will come down lower and lower and lower. He will lend to you. You shall not lend to him, because if you do, he'll be the head and you'll be the tail. Have you heard the old phrase, the dog wagging the tail? That's what happens. When you borrow from somebody else, they control you. They can control what you do. And this has happened in our nation many times. There was a time in American history we weren't borrowing from China and Japan. People were borrowing from us. We had lots of savings because we used to produce and profit. So we used to invest in or lend money to England. Well, England had built the Suez Canal, and they had lent it for a certain period of time, and it came time for them to get it back. They owned it. It was their responsibility. They wanted it back. Well, even America has done some unethical things, because even though England built it, England had a contract, and England wanted it back under the deal of the contract, America said, we don't really want to go to war. We really don't want to get involved in this. We don't want to skirmish this near us. England, stop. England says, well, we're not going to stop. We want the Suez Canal back. We said, let's have a little talk. Who is it that's financed all your economy? Oh, we did. You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking if you keep doing what you're doing, and you can do it, if you keep doing that, we might just call in your debt. We might just say it's time for you to pay back all the principal and all the interest. Well, they knew that if we called in their debt, their principal and interest, it would destroy their consumer-based economy. So they called up the troops. Hey guys, change of foreign policy, change of mind. We're going to go ahead and give that to somebody else. What did we do? We had enslaved England because we were the lender and they were the borrower. Now, why did we go off the gold standard? We'll talk about that in the week on inflation. Why in the 1970s did Nixon come out on a Sunday night and say, hey, we're going off the gold standard? It's because America started borrowing from France. And France wanted to stop us from doing a variety of things. So France put a plan together over the weekend and said, we're going to call in America's debt. They've got to pay us back the principal and interest in gold. Well, Nixon knew we couldn't do it. We had been overspending and consuming for so long. We didn't have enough gold to back up the borrowing we've been doing. So he came out, I think it was on a Sunday night, and said, we made a decision. You know, we've thought about this for a long time. It's the wise thing for the nation. We're going to go off the gold standard. Why? Because he knew Monday morning France was coming in to call in our debt. So he said, I'm not going to let them have power over me. And he moved us from primarily an enslaving economy to making inflation critical. Well, it's been going on since 1913, critical to what's happened where we are today. What's the Bible say? You don't spend your way to prosperity. You spend your way to slavery. Why do I say God wants us to experience liberty? Why does God not want us in debt to other people? Because God wants us free. God doesn't even want us in debt to him. In fact, the whole story of Christ is that every time we do something wrong, every time we sin, every time we complain, every time we're ungrateful, every time we put an idol in our life that says something's more important to me than God, we accumulate debt. Imagine every thought you've ever had, every habit you've ever had, everything you've ever said was recorded. And it is. You're accumulating debt toward God. And God looked down and said, look at the debt. You talk about the trillions or $12 trillion of American debt. That's nothing compared to the amount of debt you've accumulated toward me. So what's he going to do? He's like, I could call in the debt, but they can't pay it. I could wait for them to do good works, but they're never going to pay off trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of spiritual debt. He says, I'll come to earth and I'll pay the debt because I want to make a way that you can be in restored relationship with me. And I'll not only forgive your debt so you can be back in black, I will then deposit to your account all the righteousness that Jesus ever did. So I go not only from being trillions of dollars in debt to trillions of dollars of assets in my spiritual account because of Christ. That's what the story of God is about. That's what Jesus' story is about. I came to redeem you, to rescue you, to get you out of debt from me. And that spiritual reality plays forth in economic reality as well. We spend our way to slavery, not prosperity. And the second slogan is act your own wage. Now maybe you grew up hearing act your own age. Maybe your parents said that to you all the time, or you got lectured by your grandma or grandpa or teacher. But even more important is that we act our own wage. See, this principle is important. Whether you make $30,000, $300,000, or $1 million, discontentment will make you say, whatever I make, I want to consume more than I produce. The discontentment of idols in a human heart push us and push us to say, I deserve more. I can have more. I can have more. I can have more. I don't want to wait till I have enough savings. I don't want to have patience. I deserve it, and I deserve it now. The Bible says, act your own wage. Whatever you make, use thrift, use ingenuity, use resourcefulness to find a way to make sure that you're not consuming more than you produce. Now, how do we do that? How do we act our own wage? 3 ways. We need to look inward, look backward, and look forward. Why do I say look inward? You can read all the finance books you want in your life. And you can learn about, this makes sense, I've read this book, I think my grandma told me this. You're never going to do it. I'm never going to do it until I first look inward. I need to figure out, why do I keep making dumb choices? I know I shouldn't consume more than I produce, but I keep doing it. Why do I keep borrowing and enslaving myself? It's destroying my marriage. It's destroying my life. Why am I doing it? Jesus says, you got to answer the why question. And here's the answer. Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. All of us are building our life, whether you call yourself a Christ follower, a Christian or not. We're building our life on something. It's either on God's kingdom or some idol. And if your idol, if your sense of identity is in your status, if that's where you're building your real value, my status, you're going to say, I don't mind being enslaved because I've got to have the status of wearing those clothes and having that car and having that house. I know it's not wise, but that's my idol. It's my status. For some of us, it's our appearance. I want to look good. I want to have this surgery. I want to get this done. I got to, whatever it is, I got to get this accomplished. Our status, our appearance, our performance, as long as those idols are driving us, they're going to drive us crazy. Because until your treasure becomes God's work in you, you're going to be enslaved. And God says, I will come to liberate you. And look backwards. Look at, has this helped in your own personal budget? Has all this enslaving, has it made your marriage better? Have you really gotten freer? Has it made your life better spiritually or monetarily? No. Look backward. Look what God says. He said, there are some who pretend to be rich, but they have nothing. What's he talking about? People who pretend, look how much I'm spending, look at my car, look at my house. They pretend to be rich, but they have nothing. They don't have any savings or real assets. But then there's another type of person who pretends to be poor. He holds back some of his wealth. He doesn't spend everything he could. He pretends to be poor because he's thrifty and resourceful. But he actually has great wealth. You go to his bank account, you look at his cards, and they're paid off. You look at his life, and he actually has real savings that he can give to other people. I love this commercial. Several years ago, I saw this commercial, and it talked about people who pretend to be rich but have nothing. And it's got this guy driving in a really nice car. He's got his nice house and his nice family behind him. He's got grocery bags and shopping bags all in the car. And the narrator says, wow, you're doing really well for yourself. He says, I sure am. He says, what's the secret to your success? He says, well, I'm up to my eyeballs in debt. That's how I did it. And then the camera fades out to black and says, debt consolidation services. Here's a guy who supposedly was rich. Look at the car. Look at the house. But he'd borrowed it all. And he was just enslaved to all of his debt and all of his borrowing. He's just what the proverb says. He pretends to be rich, but he's actually poor. A lot of what's happened in the last few years are people who supposedly had nice houses, all their debts are called in because they didn't buy it with real savings, real money. The Bible calls us to act our own wage. We may pretend to be poor because we're putting margin in our life, but we actually have great wealth because we're practicing God's wisdom, not John Maynard Keynes. And what else does God say on that? Well, it says that we need to look forward. After we look inward and then we look backward, has all this debt and borrowing got us to a healthy place? No. Then we look forward. What would God have me do? Is debt always bad? You know, Christ followers disagree on this. Some people say you should never have any debt. I like how Howard Dayton says it. He says, don't borrow to consume. I think the Bible's pretty clear on that. This is just unwise. Do not borrow to consume, because when you're done consuming, you have nothing. I used my credit card to pay for the hamburger. I ate the hamburger and now I have nothing except a bill plus interest. The Bible says don't borrow to consume, but be careful about borrowing to invest. Small business loans, homes, things like that. That's different in that you're now borrowing not to consume. At the end of the day, you've now borrowed to have a business that produces, a house that supposedly will produce wealth over time. We got to be careful because the inflation of the currency and housing bubbles makes it really hard to assess real value. Here's how Howard Dayton says it. He says 3 principles when you're borrowing to invest. Number 1, make sure the item you've purchased is an asset with the potential to appreciate or produce income. You're back in Godonomics. Number 2, the value of the item equals or exceeds the amount owed against it. Number 3, whatever the payments are, don't put restraint or pressure on your family budget. I think those are 3 important principles to look at when we're talking about when are the times to borrow. Now, what happened historically? How did we get here? Well, see, back in 400 BC, Aristotle, he had an idea that the material world was evil. The Gnostic picked it up and gave this whole idea that spiritual good, material bad. Sort of, the old George Bush, spiritual good, material bad. Good, bad, good, bad. The Bible came along and said, no, the material world is good. God made it. He created it. He came into this world to be a real human being. The material world is good, and money is good. Now, this is why the Greeks, Aristotle, and others said, let's not even deal with that. Let's just have deep thoughts about philosophy all the time. The Christ followers came in and said, the material world is good. The problem is not money. The love of money can become an idol, but money is a good thing. It is something you can produce and profit from, and you can use money to do incredibly good things. Contrast that with Aristotle, who said it's sterile. He even said money was unproductive. Well, the Catholic Church picked up this idea, was influenced by it, and they said that any type of investment and charging of interest was bad. And the Old Testament clearly talks about usury, excessive interest to exploit others as wrong. Well, the Catholic Church said, well, then all interest must be wrong. And so for years, even centuries, nobody took their savings, their capital, to invest in new business until John Calvin came along. John Calvin, again, one of the reformers, said, let's go back to the Scriptures and figure out if what we've heard from the church aligns with what we're reading in the Scriptures. And he said, the story of Jesus talking about the wicked town?